Hi, guys. So, our study was on the impacts of the picture superiority effect and cognitive load on memory. So, what I want you guys to do now is I want you guys to close your eyes. And I want you to imagine that you're walking through an art museum and you're looking at all the pictures on the wall. You see one beautiful picture and you're staring at it, and below it is a verbal description of the illustration above. Which one do you think you're going to remember more details from? Do you think you're going to remember more details from the picture? Or do you think you're going to remember more details from the verbal description? According to the picture superiority effect, you're more likely to remember the details of the picture than the written words below it.
So now we're just going to talk about a few key concepts that are important to our study. Like Jill said, one of which being the picture superiority effect, and that's a main topic in our study. So the picture superiority effect is the phenomenon, sensation, and inference that picture and or images are more likely to be remembered than words. So there's been a lot of literature and scientific research done about the superiority effect, and it has been proven to be true even in those with mild cognitive impairment. So that could be autism, Alzheimer's, dementia, etc. Traumatic brain injury, so that could be brain tumors, concussions, anything of the sorts like that. And sensory processing disorders, so that could be anything from auditory and imaging processing disorders as well. And this could be assessed in multiple ways. And in this case, it's an accuracy recall test. So another key concept in our study is working memory, and this has to go along with cognitive load, which is going to be talked about in the next slide. So working memory is a cognitive system with limited capacity and utilized for the execution of cognitive tasks. And what's a key note about this is that it's only sufficiently works for around 10 seconds, and thus cognitive load has a significant effect on working memory as opposed to long-term memory. And that is a note from one of the literatures that we used in our study. And working memory is important for rational reasoning and decision making, which humans use all the time in our day-to-day lives.
So the next variable that we looked at was cognitive load. So cognitive load is the level of difficulty an activity places on the cognitive abilities of an individual. And within cognitive load, there are two different factors. So causal factors are pretty much everything outside of the task. So that may include time pressure, reward systems, and environmental pressures, while assessment factors have to do with the task and how the task impacts your cognitive abilities. So cognitive load is often difficult to measure because so many things can contribute to it. But when you focus on one aspect of cognitive load, you're more likely to find like a difference in how cognitive load affects someone's abilities. And additionally, cognitive load activates many parts of the brain. And one of our resources that we used talked about specifically the thalamus and the cerebellum. So in combining cognitive load and the picture superiority effect, we wanted to see if both had an impact on the accuracy of recall.
So in terms of the participants in our study, we had a pretty large sample size, which we're pretty proud of. There was 164 participants. We did use convenience sampling as opposed to random sampling, but there were 41 participants in each condition. We had 4 conditions in our study, and there was 123 females, 40 males, and 1 non-binary participant. There wasn't an age range between 18 years old and 64 years old, which we think that provided a large sample size and diverse age range, which gave us a pretty good telltale of sample and who was really involved in this study. There was 155 white participants, 1 African American or Black participant, 4 Asian participants, and 6 others, which again provided a huge diverse range and also just gave us a really good sample size.
So as Kate said, our participants were conveniently sampled through social media via text, Snapchat, Facebook, and other forums. And so in our study, participants received a link to the Qualtrics survey, and then they were asked to sign an informed consent form. And then once they signed that, they were put into two conditions. Either they had an image condition or a word condition. And so you could see here that they either viewed the image or they viewed the paragraph. And so we tried to make the paragraph condition as equivalent to the image as we could so that we could decrease any confounding variables. And so each participant viewed either the image or the paragraph for 2 minutes, and they were not able to leave the screen. And so after the 2 minutes were up, they would be automatically advanced to the next screen.
So in terms of the methods, again, half of the participants were put under cognitive load while the other half were not. So this included a 7-number recall task, which in terms of cognitive load, that's kind of a typical cognitive load task. So in the next slide, you could see the cognitive load number task that we gave to our participants. So half of them were given this 7-digit number. It was 5108237. So after they were shown the image or the word condition that Jill just talked about, half the participants were either shown this number or the other half were not shown this number. And this was randomly assigned to the participants. And they were shown this number for 2 minutes. And if they, on the next screen, they were asked to recall this number. And when they were asked to recall the number, they could either recall it in any number of time that they wanted to. And if they did, then they could automatically advance to the next screen, or after 2 minutes that this time would expire. And yeah, that was basically the cognitive load task that they were asked to do.
So after either seeing or not seeing the cognitive load task, every group was advanced to a series of questions. So the questions were given to test the recognition of the initial image or paragraph that the participants had seen. And depending on which condition you saw, your answers were displayed differently. So if we go to the next slide, we can see an example question. So all participants were asked how many stars were there around the moon, but the difference was that the image condition saw answers that aligned with the image, whereas the word condition had actual numbers aligning with what they had seen in the paragraph. So after answering all 10 questions, all of the participants were asked to give some demographic information, and then they were given a full debriefing.
And so in terms of what we hypothesized what would happen in the study, we thought that participants who were given the image would remember more details than those who are given words, and that corresponds with the picture superiority effect. And then we also thought that participants who are not put under cognitive load would remember more details than those in cognitive load, because if someone undergoes cognitive load in which we used a 7-digit number recall task, and our working memory can only hold around 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at one time. So we thought that the 7 number would be perfect. And if they were chosen to remember that number, it would kind of like get rid of that previous information that they saw, whether it was like the image or the word. And we thought that that would have an impact on their memory. And then ultimately, we thought that those in the picture non-cognitive load condition would remember the most details out of all 4 conditions, and that they would have the highest mean accuracy of number of answers correct.
So to figure out our data, we went into SPSS and we set up a 2x2 factorial analysis of variance, or ANOVA. And when we did this, we found that some variables were significant while others were not. So when we looked at the picture superiority effect and its impact on the accuracy of recall, we found that there was no significant impact, and we found a p-value of 0.247, which is obviously greater than 0.05. When we looked at cognitive load, we found that there was a significant difference on the accuracy of recall with a p-value of 0.023, which is less than 0.05. And then when we looked at the interaction between the picture superiority effect and cognitive load, we found a p-value of 0.631, so there was no significant interaction. So in our discussion, we talked about how we found that one variable had a significant difference while the other variable did not. So cognitive load had a significant impact on the accuracy of recalling information. And when we looked at our data, we found that participants did significantly worse when they were presented with the cognitive load task rather than when they were not. However, there was no significant impact of the picture superiority effect on the participants' accuracy of recall, and there was also no significant interaction between the two variables. So pretty much when we looked at the data, both groups, both the image and the paragraph groups did pretty much the same.
And so our hypothesis supports the idea of the cognitive load theory, but it doesn't support the picture superiority effect. And so a couple reasons why we thought that the picture superiority effect was not seen in our results is that our images are very inconsistent, whereas one image may be really big and one image may be really small. And I'll show you, and you could see that in the image that we showed before in the previous slide, whereas like some images like the cabin is very big and it's centered, and the flowers in the background are very small. And I know in a lot of literature, we see that all the images used are very consistent in size. And so we thought that if one image was bigger, it may draw more attention to that. And so that's why there could be some inconsistency with the mean accuracy. And then we also thought that one big image versus smaller images. And so again, in previous literature, all the studies that have been done with the picture superiority effect have been done with single images, whereas we'd used a very large image. So we kind of thought that maybe it might have overwhelmed our participants viewing one big image rather than individual smaller images. And so here in figure 1, you could just see our data of how many answers in each condition were correct. So we basically measured the mean accuracy. And you could see here in the words no load condition was the highest accuracy out of all 4. And then in the image no load, it's very close to the number of right answers in the words no load. So you can see that there's not really an interaction here. But if you look and compare that image no load to load for both, you could see that there's a significant difference between both of them.
So there's obviously a few key takeaways from this study. There's been a few literatures and scientific research that have been done on the picture superiority effect and cognitive load separately, but we feel that our research really ties them together and makes a connection between the two. So we connected the picture superiority effect and cognitive load, and it tells us how our brain functions when presented with visual versus written information, while also showing how cognitive load impacts our abilities of analyzing both conditions. It's also important to know that cognitive load does have a significant impact on the human brain for areas of our lives, such as healthcare, the classroom, and our everyday occupations. So it's important to note that cognitive load does have a huge impact on our ability to recall information, and that too much cognitive load can hinder one's ability to remember things, and that's important in policy making, administration, all that, all those areas in the world. So we need to take that into account. So for future research in this area, certain things that we could do is possibly target a certain demographic, such as those with traumatic brain injuries, brain tumors, concussions, and or processing disorders, to measure whether the cognitive load theory does hold true and accuracy recall. And another piece of information that we could maybe change here is, like Jill said, maybe ensuring that the picture size does remain the same, or it doesn't change size, or one's not bigger than the other, so that this is not a confound, or it's not changing, so that people aren't affected by this when they're taking the study.
Thank you.